society. In his book, Governing Through Crime, How the War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear, Simon argues that across America today, gated communities sprawl out from urban centers, employers enforce mandatory drug testing, and schools screen students with metal detectors. Social problems ranging from welfare dependency to educational inequality have been reconceptualized as crimes with a focus on assigning fault and imposing consequences. Even before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, non-citizen residents had become subject to an increasingly harsh regime of detention and deportation, and employees subject to background checks. What motivated you to write your book, Governing Through Crime, How the War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear? The title says a lot.
It does, and I began my interest in this as a criminologist, really trying to understand how America's penal system was functioning. Right here in the San Francisco Bay Area as a graduate student, I began to study California's prison system and its parole system and why so many Californians seem to be going back to prison again and again and again. And when I began to explore some of California's poorest communities where many of our prisoners came from, what I realized was that in these communities, so much other form of social order had disappeared. Jobs had disappeared, often clergy had disappeared, businesses had disappeared, social organizations had disappeared. And it was almost as if the criminal gangs and then the police were the only forms of governance really operating in these communities. And I began to think, how is this only a problem of the poor in America, that we govern them through crime and the rest of us live in a place of truer democracy? And when I began to look at the conditions of the middle class in America, especially in the 1990s, what I found to my surprise is that although they were living in good conditions, not like prisons and ghettos, they were also in many ways governed by crime. They lived in gated neighborhoods that were designed to keep strangers out. They sent their kids to schools whose main qualifications were high security rather than high achievement. And they often shopped and worked in places designed not for charm or efficiency, but again for security. And I began to realize, in a sense, America, although we think of ourselves as the freest society in the world, is also one of the most fearful, and in that sense, one of the most imprisoned at all levels of our society.
The phrases culture of fear and policy of fear and so on are phrases we have heard a lot and more often than enough associate ourselves with after the events of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. However, in your book, you argue that our everyday world became dominated by fear long before these events.
This is terribly important because, as you correctly note, many Americans and many observers around the world perhaps think that 9/11 was such a huge trauma that it sort of changed America, that it moved us from being a very open democracy toward being very mistrustful, very fearful, and very oriented toward both punishment and security. And ironically, what happened on 9/11, as terrible as it was not at all the beginning of this. In fact, what it did in a sense was it jerked Americans into recognizing how security-oriented they had become. But they then attributed that to 9/11 and perhaps to the Bush administration's overreaction to it. I would argue that if you go back to the 1960s, we've been building a culture of fear over about 4 decades, and that in many ways our response to 9/11 is a response that comes right out of that fear of crime. George Bush, who as governor of Texas executed more than 100 people and was very much associated with tough punishment toward juvenile offenders and sort of popular crime themes, when he found himself confronting the problem of terrorism, immediately knew how to respond, build prisons, call on Americans to be more fearful of strangers. So I think that whole response and many of the most alarming features of it deserve to be seen as deeper rooted features of American fear of crime. And for that reason, they're going to be a lot harder to get rid of. They're not going to disappear just because we have a new administration in Washington.
And this culture started back in the 1960s?
People often point to the Bush administration as being a decisively different kind of administration. Well, Richard Nixon was president back in 1968 when he declared a war on crime and began to build up a kind of form of executive power that many people thought was undemocratic then. And that trend has continued. Our presidents have acquired more and more power. Our lawmakers, we think of the Patriot Act as sort of a striking example of lawmakers abandoning their deliberative judgment in favor of fear and emotional panic. And yet we've had crime bills every 2 years that look remarkably like the Patriot Act. And so, again, for those of us that have been studying these trends in American society, what we saw after 9/11 was an American political elite that really understood how to govern through fear, saw this as an enormous opportunity to essentially capitalize on a new investment of fear in American life. And while we have a new administration now, which at least expresses an intent to be much less fear-dominated, it's not quite clear how easy it will be for them to begin to dismantle this essentially an infrastructure of fear that we have in America.
And why did this culture prevail, this recasting of the American citizen, as you put it in your book? Was the crime rate going up at that time, perhaps?
I think this is an issue that sociologists and criminologists and historians will be debating for a very long time. But for me, I think the crucial factors are one, the tremendous dislocations in American society that were going on in the 1960s, most of them for the good. We were breaking down racial barriers. We were breaking down gender barriers to access to the economy and to social power. Those insecurities were generating a lot of need for new forms of authority or new assertions of authority. And ironically, while we might think of crime as a very local function, because of the fact that crime, there was some real rise in crime in the 1960s, plus there was a lot of political turmoil that looked to Americans like crime, assassinations of our leaders, including President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Senator Kennedy, riots in large American cities. All of these put violence and personal security on the table in the 1960s, at a time when American leaders were looking, in a sense, for a new lever of governing, at a time when traditional forms of political power were under attack. And so I see this as, in a way, an unhappy marriage of new opportunities for freedom, which had opened up in the 60s, but also vast new forms of insecurity that in a sense, got projected onto crime. And while crime, is always a presence in all societies, since the 60s, we, in a sense, have had a myopic view on crime as being a unique and distinctive kind of threat to our social order. Conservatives who were concerned about the rapid pace of civil rights progress, for instance, could point to crime as an example of the fact that American society needed to settle down and have more authority and a little bit less freedom. So ironically, although we might think of the war on crime associated with certain more conservative figures, it actually is a tremendously bipartisan, coalitional sort of agreement. And I think one of the features of it that people don't appreciate is its complicated relationship to race relations. I think viewers all over the world understand that America has a particularly burdened legacy of racism because of our history of chattel slavery. And that continued into the 1960s, where most American cities had large areas where minority groups were exploited, not given open housing, access to jobs, etc. That began to break down very rapidly in the 60s because of the civil rights movement. And many people view the war on crime as a kind of backlash against it, a reassertion of authority in the face of this, and there's an element of truth to it. But there's also a remarkable degree to which the civil rights movement, by making it less possible to rally public culture against traditionally distrusted minorities, it became, publicly unavailable to blame difficult times or insecurity on minority groups, on ethnic groups, on religions that people might have been suspicious of. That actually made crime, in a sense, a more valuable form of stigma. Those who commit crimes appear to deserve the punishment and the security procedures that we impose on them. And so in a society that was, in a sense, breaking down many of its traditional biases and prejudices, and yet had all the traditional needs for blaming someone, criminals have become a kind of permanent available target to rally both American anxieties and our desire to do something about our insecurities.
In Governing Through Crime, Simon calls for passive citizens to become engaged partners in the management of risk and the treatment of social ills. Only by coming together to produce security can America free itself from a logic of domination by others and from the fear that currently rules their everyday lives. Tell us about this global trend that's prevailing. Do you think that governments across the globe are using the American model when it comes to their prison systems?
So it's almost astounding how much America leads the world in imprisonment. Many people don't realize that while we account for something like 5% of the world's population. We have about 25% of the world's prisoners. That's astounding. And yet, I think your viewers from around the world can take little comfort in the fact that this is an American trend because it's becoming a global trend.